Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in USA has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well, and hence IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure and reflect on the issues that are important to the American voters. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice on the larger world with particular focus on India and highlight the role played by Indian and other diaspora communities in the US election. On the face of it, the American society seems polarized like never before, with some scholars suggesting that the country is on brink of a civil war and politicians further declaring that the nation needs a national divorce. Charges of voting fraud, conspiracy theories, and algorithm fueled echo chambers have made the case even worse, and former President Donald Trump's inclination towards dictatorial tendencies has caused concern among many. On issues like immigration, climate change, abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, gun violence, a culture war seems to be flaring up, and there seems no scope for a moderate position. Some scholars claim that it is the politicians and media that is amplifying the extreme positions. However, a recent study conducted by Rice University suggests that even mainstream Americans are feeling more polarized than ever. In the two party system that the US follows, people identify with their parties, and as the two parties have relentlessly moved further apart ideologically, leaders are more likely to be punished if they reach across the aisle. And because many more districts are now deeply red or blue, rather than a mix of constituencies, House members have fewer reasons to adopt moderate positions. Recent survey data reveal that more than half of Republicans and Democrats view the other party as a threat, and nearly as many agree with the description of the other party as evil. Liliana Mason, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University and author of Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity, has characterized this polarization as one that's based on our feelings for each other, not based on extremely divergent policy preferences. False perception is also playing a major role in increasing the divides, as most partisans hold major misbeliefs about the other party's preferences that lead them to think that there is far less shared policy belief. No matter the nature of polarization, the divisions only seem to get reinforced as we draw closer to the presidential elections. It is not the first time that the country is as divided. The United States has faced divisions during the War of Independence and over the question of slavery as well. In fact, so divisive was the question of slavery that it led to secession of states and ultimately the Civil War. If history is any guide, then such polarization will bring to fore bloody conflicts, the wounds of which will take decades to heal, if they even heal. Instances of violence are already visible on the political landscape, as seen in the Capitol riots of 2020 and the police brutality against student protesters at American universities. Further, there seems to be an erosion of democratic values and mistrust in democratic institutions. In our ongoing series about the US presidential elections, to discuss the polarization in American society and the impact it might have on the upcoming elections, today we are joined by Professor Anthony Fowler. Professor Anthony Fowler is faculty in the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. His research applies econometric methods for causal inference to questions in political science, with particular emphasis on elections and political representation. He is editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science. an author of Thinking Clearly with Data, and a host of Not Another Politics podcast. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to talk to you.
So, number of studies have pointed out, have suggested that the American society is polarized like never before. Do you agree with such assertions? And is such polarization in the US a never before seen phenomena, or have there been other instances?
I don't agree with that general assessment. So I think it's useful to separate our discussion of public polarization and elite polarization. So if you just think about the public for a moment, just regular citizens and voters and so forth, I don't see any evidence that they are particularly polarized. So for example, if you just ask people a bunch of policy questions and try to figure out where do they stand on the kind of typical left-right ideological spectrum, most people are somewhere in the middle, and you get kind of a nice normal distribution of people, with most people to the right of the Democratic Party, most people to the left of the Republican Party, and they're really not all that divided. There aren't that many extremists out there. People also aren't really, maybe as partisan as you might think. Yes, it's true that a lot of people might vote for the same party in most elections, but that's, that makes sense if you think about how far apart the candidates are and so forth. But you don't find that people are so partisan, for example, that they just ignore what the other side says. They get news from multiple sources. They're willing to be persuaded by arguments from the other side and so forth. So there's lots of studies to cite on that. But overall, I think the public is not nearly as polarized as people think. Um, there is, of course, a difference between people who self-identify as Democrats and Republicans. Obviously, Democrats are more to the left, Republicans are more to the right. And that difference seems to have been increasing a little bit over time. But there's also a big number of people who don't identify as either Democratic or Republican. And some of that increasing difference between Democrats and Republicans appears to be increased sorting on ideology. So people changing how which party they identify, rather than people actually becoming more extreme over time. And then I'll just briefly say, the flip side of this is to think about the elite level, to think about candidates and party leaders and so forth. And they are very polarized, I would say. And that difference seems to be growing over time. So there's a really interesting disconnect there, that at the elite level, our politics is probably more polarized than it has been in a very long time. But at least more polarized than it has been in the last 100 years or so. But at the public level, I'd say the things are not as polarized as you might think if you just read cable, read the social media or watch cable news and so forth.
Not polarized, then what are some of the hot button issues in American politics at the moment? As you pointed out, that if we go by cable news, then the society seems very polarized, and it seems like there are issues such as gun violence, abortion rights, minimum wages, woke culture, culture wars, immigration, where there seems to be a no moderate position. And why is there a disconnect between why is there an elite polarization? Aren't like the leaders supposed to represent the issues and the ideas that are dear to the public and not vice versa?
Yeah, let me say a few things about that. There's a lot in that question. It's a great question. So first, what are the big hot button issues? So one interesting thing is that we tend to fixate on the hot button issues that kind of divide us at the moment, that divide Democrats and Republicans, and we ignore all of the issues over which maybe we've achieved some kind of consensus or agreement, or they're no longer salient issues because we've kind of sorted things out. So one pressing example of that is gay marriage, which was a very salient issue for a brief moment in time. We were talking about it a lot, maybe 10 years ago, and now we don't talk about it anymore because gay marriage is legal in the US. Most people support it, even most Republicans support it, and so it's just not a big issue that we talk about anymore. So that's one reason I think why we overstate the level of polarization, is because people, we tend to fixate on the issues that are really dividing us right now and almost forgetting about all the other issues where maybe we're not so polarized. But you're right, there are some of these, pressing, polarizing issues right now. You said that there's no moderate position on a lot of these issues. And I don't think I agree with that. I think most Americans do have moderate positions on these issues. So if you ask most Americans, what do you think the federal minimum wage should be? The current federal minimum wage is $7.25. And, most Democrats think it should be at least $15. you can't even get a Republican to say it should go any higher than 725. So there's a big yawning gulf between what the party leaders are saying and what the candidates are saying. But if you just ask regular people, most of them say, yeah, probably $10, $11, $12. You get kind of moderate answers from most regular citizens. And even the Democrats and Republicans aren't that far apart. Maybe the typical Democrat says $12 and the typical Republican says $10. And even if you go to a place like San Francisco, which is known to be, one of the, if not the most liberal progressive cities in the country, the average person in San Francisco thinks it should be about $12, 12.50 or something like that. So the public is just really not that polarized, and there are moderate positions on a lot of these issues. The public is usually there somewhere in between, but it is interesting that the candidates are taking these extreme positions. And then you ask, why is that the case? Why are the candidates taking these extreme positions when you would think their electoral incentives should be to moderate and capture, the median voter and so forth? That is a big puzzle. That's one of the puzzles that motivates a lot of my recent research. I don't think we have definitive answers to that, but I think there's a range of possible answers. One is that the kind of people who select into running for office are themselves extremists. It's hard to get competent, moderate people to want to run for office to begin with, and that's obviously a problem and something I'm studying. I think the political system and the political institutions often enforce extremism. So if you're a member of Congress, for example, and you want to stay in favor with the party, if you want to get a good committee position, if you want to get future endorsements for a higher level office, you need to make sure you do what Chuck Schumer or Mitch McConnell wants you to do. And very often that's do something more partisan or more extreme than what your voters would really want you to do. So there's a lot to say about that topic. I find it to be a really interesting puzzle right now in American politics.
Do you think that the media landscape, how it is today, is not also not helping the case? Because we see that, with most of people receive their information from social media, and uh, sometimes you get caught in echo chambers because of how algorithms works, where if you click on, if you are leaning towards a particular view, then you keep on getting information about the same view, like the same opinion repeatedly. And also, like, legacy media houses are particularly amplifying those extreme positions.
Yes, so I think there's a few things to say about that. So I think one is I think it's not true that most Americans are stuck in echo chambers, just empirically speaking. If you look at the data, there's some nice studies. Andrew Guest, for example, from Princeton has a nice study on this. If you actually track people's actual media consumption, most Americans, they get their news from Yahoo News or from Google News or some other aggregator, and they read from a pretty wide range of sources. They might read one article on CNN and another article on Fox News and another from, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and USA Today and so on. And they might have some sense of what the partisan slant is of each of these outlets, but they're interested in reading from a broad range of sources. And the same thing on social media. I think it's not as stark as you might think. Most people are friends with people from the other party. Most people see social media posts from members of the other party and so forth. So it's perhaps not as stark as you might think, except for maybe a small subset of really hyper partisan, hyper online people who maybe are stuck in their little partisan echo chambers. But at the public level, I think there is a demand for a broad range of news sources. There's demand for moderate news and so forth. At the elite level, again, why, given that there is that demand, why aren't there lots of media outlets that are really catering to those moderate voters? And that's an interesting puzzle too. It is troubling that media outlets have become so partisan and so slanted, such that I think a lot of people in the middle are right to think, I can't really trust what I hear on Fox News or CNN. And so that might lead a lot of people to just kind of tune out altogether, to pay less attention, to just believe whatever they thought before, which might be the rational thing to do. But obviously it'd be better if people could get more informed, they could really learn about policy issues, they could engage in interesting political debates and so on, they could try to persuade each other. A lot of that isn't happening because the news is currently so partisan and so slanted. And it's not entirely so. So we just had a presidential debate. I think it wasn't great probably for either candidate, but I think the consensus was Biden really underperformed and revealed that maybe he's not 100% with it and on top of the issues and so on. And there has been a lot of criticism of Biden, which I think is fair, even coming from left-wing kind of liberal slanted outlets. The New York Times editorial board has asked for Biden to step down. And I think most rational voters in the middle say that's a really strong informative signal that Biden maybe really isn't fit for office, because even the New York Times is saying so. So there are some cases where people really do learn a lot from the media, despite the slant of the media, or maybe even because of the media. But in general, I think it's maybe not a good thing that our media outlets are as partisan and slanted as they are.
As you mentioned, the first presidential debate was recently concluded, and both the candidates are quite old. Has that dampened the enthusiasm for elections? And do you think the choices that the American voters, would it be safe to conclude that the choices are that the American voters are being offered, there's not much diversity in it, especially on the Republican side? Because as you mentioned, on the Democratic side, you still have people who are saying that Biden should resign or should continue, and there's a variety there, right? But on the Republican side, they all seem to have fallen in line with Donald Trump's worldview.
So yes, I think there's a lot to say there about this current presidential election. You have two presidents who are pretty unpopular, who are regarded as relatively unpopular, unsuccessful presidents. We know a lot about them, and I think there's a lot of voters who are sitting there thinking, I can't believe with all these hundreds of millions of people in this country, these are our two best choices for president. So I think there is a lot of general frustration with that. I don't know. I don't know if I want to say that the age of the candidates per se matters. I think we have a history of voting for older candidates, and I think to the extent that older candidates are actually more experienced and maybe have a little more wisdom and so forth, that's not a bad thing. And I think most voters are open to voting for older candidates. But I think there are serious questions about, is Joe Biden mentally fit for office? Has his mental faculties declined significantly, even over the past 4 years, such that he's no longer as qualified or fit as he was when we voted for him last time. There are serious concerns, I think, about both Trump and Biden. I'm not sure if I agree with your characterization that things are more open on the Democratic side. The Republican Party had a open primary with a bunch of qualified, experienced candidates that ran, and the Republican primary voters chose Trump. Now, you may not agree with them, but I think if you're a Republican, I think at least you can say you had a choice. There were a range of candidates that ran, maybe not a really wide range, but there was a range of ideologies. There was a range of different views on different issues, kind of more, disagreements on foreign policy, disagreements on immigration, disagreements on kind of pro versus anti-establishment thinking and how to run the bureaucracy and so forth. And rightly or wrongly, the Republican primary voters chose Trump. And on the Democratic side, we didn't have a lot of serious candidates challenging Biden and running in the primary. And I think a lot of Democrats were frustrated by that. And so then maybe now they're particularly frustrated at this moment we've arrived at, which is now we're saying, oh, maybe Biden's not fit for office. Maybe we need to pick someone else. And they're thinking we should have had a primary where we were given those choices and we could have decided for ourselves.
While it is true that the Republican primaries were held and there was some sort of choice, but everybody agreed that Trump is going to be finally the candidate, right? And most the there is a narrative that those who are truly Republican or conservative in that sense do not find that space in the party anymore, and the party has fallen in line with Donald Trump's worldview. And why has that happened? Why has so Trump is not really a conservative, but the Republican Party has sort of fallen in line with his ideas. Why has that happened? Is it also because Trump is seen as sort of when he was first entered politics, he was sort of seen as a disruptor, and does that embody the mistrust or the lack of trust that people have in democratic institution, where they believe that democracy or government is benefiting only the rich and the powerful? Does that image of him continue to hold true?
So I think there's been a gradual realignment in American politics, and I think Trump, you could argue, Trump is just kind of a continuation of that, and maybe he's a very stark example of that. But in the sense that he's obviously very different from Mitt Romney and John McCain and previous Republican presidential nominees. But I think there has been this realignment where the Democratic Party is increasingly becoming the party of rich, educated people who live in cities. And the Republican Party, seeing that, and they're maybe losing some of the kind of they used to, the Republican Party used to be kind of the party of the rich, I would say, has now losing some of the rich, educated people in cities, and you're seeing them realign and cater more toward the working class in different ways. And so that's a fascinating realignment. And even what we think of as traditionally left and right is now a little bit confusing in American politics, because a lot of the big things that Democrats are pushing for are not really economically progressive in the conventional sense. Student loan relief, subsidies for electric cars, those are mostly things that benefit rich, educated people, and they're taking taxpayer dollars from working class people to pay for them. So anyway, so that realignment is fascinating, and I think Trump is kind of a result of that. Trump is a symptom of that, which is he's a different kind of Republican. He's not the Republican who's catering to, I mean, yes, he still is catering a bit to really rich people, and he wants tax cuts, and he's supporting things that they really care about, but he's also doing more things that appeal toward regular working class voters. So there is some, when you said something like Trump isn't really a conservative. I think a lot of people would disagree with that. And I think even what it means to be a liberal or conservative is a little bit in flux right now in the US. But I think Trump is an example of this interesting gradual realignment where things used to be more about income, and now they're perhaps more about education. So the college educated versus the non-college educated divide is really growing in American politics, and Trump is really appealing to people who are not college educated. Um, so anyway, so there's a lot going on there. I don't think it's just Trump, and it could be that Trump kind of either just lucked into this, maybe Trump was aware that this was already happening and realized this was a good opportunity for him, but Trump has kind of appealed to a different kind of voter than previous Republican candidates had appealed to, and he's doing it somewhat successfully.
Uh, no matter what the electoral outcome is, do you think the political landscape would, how do you think the political landscape would change in the coming 4 to 5 years? Would there be further realignments, and are there reasons one should be hopeful?
So I think there's probably no going back. I think you're not going to see the parties kind of shift back to where they were before, at least not in the very near future. So I think you probably will see some of this continuing trend, this divide between elite and non-elite, college educated and not college educated, and so forth. I mean, one sense in which is Donald Trump really conservative? One sense in which the Republicans really aren't conservative is that no major party is really advocating for significantly cutting spending and shrinking the size of government and so forth. Seriously doing something about the national debt, entitlement reform, things like that. So in that sense, there's no actual traditional committed small government conservatives around anymore. And like we said, the meaning of what liberal and conservative means in the US is changing. But so I think I would predict probably more of the same kind of thing going forward. I don't think once Trump is no longer in public life, the Republican Party will go back to the way it was before. But it's hard to predict. I think there's a real challenge for the Democratic Party right now, because you can't win a lot of federal elections by only catering to rich, educated people who live in cities. That's not enough people. And so, and the Electoral College and the Senate, the way that we run our elections is not conducive to mainly catering to rich, educated people in cities. So they're going to have to do something else to try to appeal to a broader set of people, appeal to the working class. And I don't know exactly how that's going to shake out, but I think whichever party figures out how to actually appeal to regular, moderate people in the middle, working class people, and so forth, that's the party that's going to do better in the coming years in American politics.
So you say that, Americans are moderate, but then we see like instances of violence breaking out. For example, the Capitol riots, right? How do you see that? Is that another divide of the college going people versus the non-college going people? Or is that we also see that increasing racism during the COVID pandemic time. There was like increasing incidents of racism towards the Asians. There's also anti-immigration, although anti-immigration agenda has always been there in the US, whether people would like to believe it or not. We had the I Know Nothing party, the nativist party, and we had those parties in the past also. But these instances of violence were exemplified in, for example, in the Capitol riots. Do you think they are sort of like they are anomalies, or for us, for what I was reading or hearing about in the news, for me that was like a characteristic that America is so polarized. But do you think that is one isolated incident? How do you view that, this
Mhm.
state of violence?
Yeah, I think a lot of these incidents you're talking about, they do reflect the behavior of a pretty small number of people, right? I don't think the Capitol rioters on January 6th were reflective of broader public opinion in American politics. So it's a small number of people. I don't think it's a particularly new thing. I think every election, there's a small number of partisan extremists who are really upset about the results of the election. And what was different about this one? I mean, there were lots of things different about this one. One is that Trump himself didn't concede the election and didn't acknowledge that he had lost, which is obviously not a good thing for democracy. But the other big thing was there was a massive security failure. A group of a few hundred people were allowed to break into the Capitol building and disrupt the business of the U.S. government and of Congress. And that's a terrible thing that happened. That's more of a security failure than it is anything else. I think after every election, I could probably find a few hundred people who are really angry about the outcome of the election and would be willing to do something crazy. And so the question is, can our democracy survive a few hundred people who are really angry? And I think the answer should be obviously yes. So the fact that there were some crazy people who stormed the Capitol, is that in and of itself a terrible thing for democracy? No, I think that's kind of normal business as usual, and we have to have the security apparatus to deal with that. If we took if we took a longer historical view, have racism and political violence and extremism and craziness, are they going up or down? I think almost surely most of those things are going down over time. There are fewer racist incidents. There are fewer incidents of political violence and so forth. There are these blips. We shouldn't encourage them. We shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't say, oh, that's fine. We should do everything we can to mitigate these things and make sure they don't happen and make sure they don't disrupt people's lives and so forth. But I don't see January 6th as just in and of itself evidence that America is so polarized or a broad set of people support political violence. I think the answer is they don't. I think most Americans do believe in democracy. They support democracy. They don't support political violence. And I think we're kind of sometimes selective about which things we decide to make a big deal about and which things we decide to downplay. Um, so all of that is to say, it's not nothing, obviously. We shouldn't be complacent. We should care about these things. But I don't think things are so bad that many millions of Americans are ready to take up arms and start a civil war and so forth.